Blood on linoleum smells exactly like loose change and dread. That was Josephine's first coherent thought when the man with a bullet buried in his ribs crashed through her front door. The storm outside was already swallowing the city sirens whole. But the real emergency was bleeding all over her cheap entryway rug. He wasn't a prince in disguise, and she wasn't anyone's savior. He was a violent man from a violent world. She caught babies for a living, but tonight she was going to have to catch him instead. The rain didn't fall. It hurled itself against the single-pane glass of Josephine's apartment like a beggar demanding to be let in. It was a miserable, bruised purple kind of Tuesday night. The power had flickered out 20 minutes earlier, leaving the apartment smelling of dust, dead pilot lights, and the cheap wax of the 2 emergency candles she'd struck and jammed onto saucers. Josephine, Joe to the mothers she coached through long labors, Miss Mercer to the clinic billing department, was drained. It was a bone-deep marrow kind of fatigue. Her scrubs were stiff with dried amniotic fluid at the hems. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that kept perfect time with her pulse. She sat on the edge of her sagging sofa, staring at a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, trying to find the energy to unlace her sneakers. Then came the noise. It wasn't a knock. A knock implies manners. It was a heavy, wet thud against the cheap particle board door, followed by a scraping sound, like a sack of wet sand sliding down wood. Joe froze. The neighborhood was rough, the kind of place where you ignored screams if they didn't call out your own name. But trouble rarely climbed all the way to the 4th floor. Another thud, weaker this time. She got to her feet, her joints popping in the silence. She didn't grab a weapon. A kitchen knife against whoever was out there would be a joke. She crossed to the door, pressing her bare palm to the cool painted wood. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, harder. "I'm calling the cops." A wet, rattling exhale came through the gap under the door. "Do that," a voice rasped. It sounded like gravel grinding together. "And I'll bleed out before they find the right building." Joe shut her eyes. The cynical, exhausted part of her, the part that had already seen 3 teenage mothers that week alone, told her to walk away, to let the hallway deal with it, to let the janitor find him in the morning. But her hands were already unlocking the deadbolt. The chain slid back with a metallic rattle. She pulled the door open. He didn't step inside. He spilled in. Joe scrambled back as a mass of soaked wool, leather, and heavy bone collapsed onto her entryway floor. He hit hard on his side, breath hitching in a sharp, involuntary hiss. "Hey!" Joe snapped, shock overriding her fear. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey, look at me!" He was massive, not gym-sculpted vanity big, but dense and functional. His black wool coat was heavy with rainwater, his dark hair plastered to a pale, sharp-angled face. His eyes were squeezed shut, but it was the smell that reached her first. Ozone from the storm, wet dog wool, and the sharp, unmistakable tang of fresh blood. He was clutching his left side. Blood, thick, dark, arterial, seeped between his white-knuckled fingers, pooling on the linoleum and mixing with the muddy water from his boots. He cracked one eye open, dark brown, glassy with pain, but lucid. "You a nurse?" He grunted, voice tight. "Midwife," Joe said, hands already moving. She grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat. "Let go of your side. I need to look." He barked a laugh that ended in a wet cough. "A midwife. Perfect. Push. Breathe. Let go of your side," Joe repeated, dropping into the flat, authoritative tone she used when a delivery went sideways. It worked. His hand relaxed, falling away to show a ruined dress shirt underneath. Joe pulled the fabric back. It tore with a sickening wet sound. The entry wound sat just below his floating rib, ugly, puckered, dark, steadily weeping. "Did it go through?" she asked, mind already cataloging towels, boiling water, the lidocaine in her trauma kit. "Felt it hit the brick wall behind me," he rasped, head falling back against her floorboards. "So, yeah, it went through." "Don't move," Joe ordered. She stood, her sneakers slipping slightly in the slick mix of blood and water. She needed light. She needed supplies. As she turned toward the bathroom, a cold, heavy grip closed around her ankle. She looked down. His hand, slick with his own blood, was wrapped around her leg. The grip was frighteningly strong for a man who'd lost half his blood volume. "No cops?" he said. The glassy haze in his eyes cleared, replaced by something cold, sharp, and intensely violent. "No ambulances. You fix this, or you let me rot right here. Understood?" Joe looked down at him. She noticed the bulge of a holster under his left arm. She noticed the expensive cut of the ruined clothes. She knew exactly what kind of man bled out in fourth-floor apartments on Tuesday nights. "I don't care if you rot," she said, voice completely flat. "But you're not doing it on my floor. Let go of my leg." He held her gaze a long second, then his fingers slowly uncurled. Dragging a man who weighed well over 200 pounds into the kitchen turned into a study in ugly, ungraceful mechanics. Joe hooked her arms under his armpits, forearms pressed against his soaked chest, and pulled. He tried to push with his boots, but his legs kept giving out. By the time she had him propped against the cheap laminate cabinets under the kitchen window, they were both winded. A thick red smear tracked across the floor like a gruesome snail trail. "Up," she grunted, hauling his torso. "Jesus," he hissed through gritted teeth, head lolling against the cabinet. "You've got terrible bedside manner. You're not in a bed," Joe replied, kicking a stool out of the way. She'd set the 2 emergency candles on the counter, and in the flickering yellow glow the kitchen looked like a slaughterhouse. Joe dropped her trauma bag onto the linoleum, a bag she'd quietly built up over 3 years at the clinic. Gauze, surgical scissors, betadine, a few precious vials of lidocaine, suture kits. She'd taken it for the uninsured mothers who sometimes needed off-the-books care, not for mobsters. She knelt beside him, the knees of her scrubs soaking up his blood. She took her trauma shears and cut his shirt open from hem to collar. It fell away, revealing a chest marked with fading bruises and a few old silvery scars. "Name," Joe said, uncapping a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the bottle in her hand. "I need your name to keep you anchored," she said flatly. "If you pass out, I need something to yell to bring you back. Otherwise, I might just leave you here." His jaw worked. "Roman, okay, Roman. This is going to hurt." Joe didn't wait for him to brace. She poured the rubbing alcohol straight into the wound. Roman didn't scream. He didn't even yell. His back arched off the cabinets, boots scraping frantically against the floor, and a low, guttural sound tore out of his throat. His right hand shot out and closed around Joe's wrist with crushing force. Her bones ground together, pain flaring up her arm. "Let go," she said quietly, staring straight to his eyes. He was breathing hard, chest heaving, sweat mixing with rain on his forehead. He stared at her, but his pupils were blown wide. He was seeing whatever alley or warehouse he'd just crawled out of. "Roman," Joe said, dropping her voice an octave, sliding into the cadence she used to talk feral panic down. "Look at the candles, look at my face. You're in a kitchen, you're safe. Let go of my wrist so I can fix this." He blinked. The fog in his eyes parted. He looked at his hand around her arm and, realizing what he'd done, released her instantly. "Sorry," he muttered, barely audible. Joe ignored the apology. She didn't want him humanized, she wanted him patched and gone. She soaked a gauze pad in betadine and began cleaning the edges of the entry wound. "Bullet went clean through," she said, leaning over to check his back. "Exit wound's messy, torn muscle. Missed the lung or you'd be blowing pink bubbles. You got lucky, feels lucky," he groaned, tipping his head back. Joe prepped the syringe. "Lidocaine numbs the surface, but you'll still feel the pressure when I stitch." She injected the local anesthetic in a ring around the jagged edges of the tear. Roman watched her hands, the dried blood on her scrub pants, the bags under her eyes, the total absence of a tremble in her fingers. She worked with the detached efficiency of a mechanic swapping a tire. "You do this often?" he asked, voice tightening as the needle went in. "Stitch gunshot wounds?" "No." Joe threaded a curved needle with black nylon suture. "Stitch up perineums torn to shreds every week?" "Tissue's tissue." A weak smirk ghosted across his lips. "Comparing me to a—" "Don't laugh," Joe warned, pressing a sterile pad to his side. "You'll pull the muscle." Deep breath, he inhaled. She drove the needle through the thick skin of his side. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds in the apartment were rain hammering the glass, Roman's ragged breathing, and the wet snick of suture thread pulling tight. Joe was fully in her element now. The exhaustion from earlier had burned away under adrenaline and focus. She was close enough to smell the expensive, spicy cologne underneath the blood and sweat, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. He was shivering hard now, shock setting in. "Almost done?" she murmured, tying off a knot with quick, precise fingers. "Snip, that's the front. Lean forward. Roman obeyed, forehead resting against her shoulder as she reached around to close the exit wound on his back, his hair brushing her neck. He was heavy, his body heat seeping through her thin scrubs. For one brief, entirely inappropriate second, Jo felt a strange awareness settle over her. He wasn't just a patient, he was a man, a dangerous, very alive man, leaning his full weight into her. She shut the thought down hard, punishing herself by pulling the next knot a little too tight. Roman flinched. Easy, don't get shot, Jo replied. She finished his back, taped thick gauze over both sides, and wrapped his torso tight with an ace bandage, pulling it taut for pressure. There, she said, sitting back on her heels, wiping sweat off her forehead with the back of her wrist. You're closed up. If it gets infected, you're dead. If you tear the stitches, you bleed out. Roman lifted his head slowly. He looked down at the neat, tight bandaging, then back at Jo. Candlelight cut harsh shadows across her face, catching the sharp line of her jaw and the deep fatigue in her eyes. Thank you, he said. It wasn't a throwaway courtesy, it carried weight. Jo stood, gathering her blood-soaked shears and the empty lidocaine vial. Don't thank me. Just figure out how you're getting off my floor before my landlord comes for rent Friday. The storm burned itself out somewhere around 4 a.m, leaving behind a sky the color of dirty dishwater and a heavy, ringing quiet. Jo hadn't slept. She'd dragged Roman from the kitchen to her pull-out sofa, a process that involved plenty of swearing on her end and a few stifled groans on his. Once horizontal, he'd passed out almost instantly, his body shutting down to conserve what it had left. Jo spent the rest of the night scrubbing, on her hands and knees with a bucket of cold water, a splash of bleach, and an old toothbrush, working blood out of the baseboards. The metallic smell faded, replaced by the sharp chemical burn of chlorine. Her hands were raw, and the ache in her back had sharpened into a stabbing pain. She stood, cracked her neck, and looked at the sofa. Roman was asleep. Without the heavy coat and blood, he looked different, younger maybe, undeniably striking, in a rough, unpolished way. A strong, straight nose, a sharp jaw shadowed with stubble, thick lashes resting against pale cheeks. But even asleep, there was something coiled in him. His hands weren't relaxed. They stayed curled into loose fists at his sides. Jo walked into the tiny galley kitchen and turned on the tap. Power had come back an hour earlier. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, listening to the rising hiss of water. She leaned against the counter, mug in hand, staring at the wall. The adrenaline was fully gone now, leaving behind a cold, creeping paranoia. Who was he running from? Who'd shot him? Were they looking for him? A shift in the sofa's fabric made her turn. Roman was awake, dark eyes fixed entirely on her. No groggy blinking, no confused looking around. He simply woke, immediately assessed the room, and locked on to the only other person in it. Jo didn't flinch. She took a sip of coffee. You're alive. Roman pushed himself up slowly on one elbow, wincing as the pulled muscles in his side protested, and swung his legs over the edge of the sofa, movements slow and deliberate. He looked down at his bare chest, at the crisp white bandages wrapping his ribs. Looks like it, he said, voice a dry rasp. He cleared his throat. Water? Jo crossed to the sink, handed him a glass, and stepped back immediately, keeping her distance. Roman took it, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was warm, but the fever hadn't set in. He drank it in 3 long gulps and set the glass on her cheap coffee table. He looked around the apartment, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the stack of medical textbooks on the floor, the ancient humming refrigerator, and finally, Jo herself, now in a different set of scrubs, hair pulled into a messy knot, a defensive scowl etched into her face. I made a mess of your place, Roman said. I cleaned it, Jo replied coldly. Most of it. The rug's ruined. Roman reached into the pocket of his discarded trousers, draped over a dining chair, and pulled out a thick silver money clip holding a stack of $100 bills thicker than Jo's entire monthly paycheck. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. For the rug. And the supplies. Jo stared at the money. It was insulting. It was a lifeline. It was dirty. I don't want your money, she said, her voice shaking slightly. She hated that it shook. I want you to leave. The rain stopped. You can walk. Get out. Roman didn't move. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, ignoring the pull on his stitches, and really looked at her, noting the contradictions. She lived in a dump but turned down thousands of dollars. She was terrified of him, but she'd stitched him up with a surgeon's steady hands. "Do you know who I am?" he asked softly. "Not arrogant, genuine. I know you carry a gun, you pay in cash, and you bleed like everybody else," Joe said, arms crossed. "That's all I need to know. The door's right there." Roman held her stare for a long moment. A heavy, suffocating tension filled the small room. Not the tension of violence, but something else. A strange, quiet recognition. Slowly he stood, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the wall. He picked up his ruined shirt and heavy coat, leaving the money behind. He walked to the door, boots heavy on the clean floorboards, and paused with his hand on the knob. He didn't turn around. "The money stays, Josephine." Joe froze. "I never told you my name." He turned his head just enough to show her the hard line of his profile. "Saw your mail on the table." A pause. "You saved my life, Josephine. I don't leave debts unpaid." He opened the door and stepped into the damp, echoing hallway. It clicked shut behind him, leaving Joe alone, staring at the stack of blood money on her table, understanding with cold certainty that this wasn't over. The clinic smelled of industrial floor wax, fear, and the stale powdered milk they kept in the break room. For 3 days after the storm, Josephine buried herself in that smell. It was her armor. She delivered a breech baby Thursday to a terrified 19-year-old who screamed until the capillaries burst around her eyes. She spent Friday arguing with indifferent insurance adjusters, her voice grinding down into a dull, mechanical monotone. She worked until her feet swelled against her sneakers, and her brain felt packed with wet cotton. She did it on purpose. Exhaustion was the only thing keeping the memory of the bleeding man in the black coat from crawling behind her eyes every time she blinked. But the money stayed. It sat exactly where Roman had dropped it, a thick, insulting brick of $100 bills bound with a silver clip. It felt radioactive. Joe hadn't touched it. She drank her morning coffee staring at it. She ate instant noodles glaring at it. It was a physical piece of a world she'd spent her whole adult life avoiding. A world of violence, quick fixes, and consequences that came knocking at midnight. Saturday evening, the illusion of her normal life cracked completely. Joe trudged up 4 flights of stairs, keys dangling from tired fingers. She paused on the 3rd-floor landing to catch her breath, leaning against the peeling seafoam paint. The hallway usually smelled of boiled cabbage and wet dog. Today it smelled faintly of bleach and pine. She reached her door and froze. The cheap fraying welcome mat was gone, replaced by a thick, dark gray runner. But that wasn't what raised the hair on her neck. Her door was closed, the deadbolt locked, but a small white envelope was wedged into the jamb. Joe snatched it, heart hammering. She let herself in and threw the deadbolt behind her with a sharp, metallic clack. She stood in the cramped entryway, the silence pressing in. The money still sat on the table. She tore the envelope open. No letterhead, no signature, just 2 lines in a sharp, slanted scrawl of black ink. "Your landlord has been compensated for the remainder of your lease. The locks on your windows have been replaced." Joe dropped the paper like it burned. She spun toward the window above her fire escape. The rusted, broken latch she'd ignored for 2 years was gone, replaced by a heavy brushed steel locking mechanism, screws still gleaming. A cold, suffocating wave of violation washed over her. He'd been inside, or his people had. They'd moved through her space, touched her things, assessed her weak points, and quietly patched them. It wasn't kindness. It was control. A predator circling its prey, building a fence to keep the other predators out. Her hands started to shake, not with fear, with rage. She survived this city by staying invisible. She kept her head down. She paid rent late, but she paid it, and she owed nothing to anyone. Roman had ripped that away in a single afternoon. She grabbed her coat. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. It didn't feel like hers. She marched downstairs, boots hammering concrete, pushed through the heavy front doors, and stepped into the humid, exhaust-choked evening. Streetlights flickered on, throwing long, warped shadows across the cracked pavement. "Going somewhere, Josephine?" The voice came from the mouth of the alley beside her building. The same gravel and ash rasp, smooth but heavy. Joe stopped dead. She turned. Roman leaned against the brick wall, half in shadow, dressed in a dark suit tailored to accommodate the bandage she knew was still strapped to his ribs. A lit cigarette hung between his fingers, the cherry glowing in the twilight. Rich, expensive tobacco smoke cut through the city smog. "You broke into my home?" Joe said. Her voice stayed steady, cold as riverstone. Roman pushed off the wall and stepped into the light, moving slower than before, a stiffness in his torso betraying the wound. But he still carried himself like an apex predator. "I secured your home," he corrected, stopping a few feet away, eyes flicking over her face. The anger, the tight jaw. "That fire escape latch was a joke. Anyone could have popped it with a butter knife. It's none of your business." Joe stepped closer, rage overriding caution. "You don't get to touch my things. You don't get to pay my rent. I don't want your protection, Roman. You have it anyway." He took a drag, smoke curling around his sharp jaw. "You saved my life. In my world that puts a target on your back. If the people who put a bullet in me find out a civilian patched me up, they won't hesitate to use you against me. Then stay away from me." The shout echoed down the empty street. "If you stay away, they won't know." Roman looked at her, expression unreadable. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his shoe, and stepped closer, into her space. The scent of tobacco, rain, and dark cologne wrapped around her. Joe held her ground, refusing to back away, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "It's too late for that," Roman murmured, voice dropping low and intimate. He looked down at her, watching the nervous flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. "I already know you're there, Josephine. You're not invisible anymore." He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The air between them felt thick enough to catch fire. Joe stared up into his dark, assessing eyes and understood, with a sinking feeling, that he wasn't only talking about his enemies, he was talking about himself too. "Take the money back," she whispered fiercely. "No." He turned away, straightening his jacket. A sleek black town car pulled out from a side street, headlights slicing through the gloom, and idled smoothly at the curb. The rear door popped open. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Lock your new windows, Josephine. The city's getting worse." He folded himself into the back seat. The door shut with a heavy, expensive thud, and the car glided into traffic, leaving Joe alone on the sidewalk, breathing hard, caught between anger and a dark, electric curiosity. The summons came 4 nights later, exactly at midnight. Joe stood at her kitchen sink scrubbing a scorched frying pan when a sharp, authoritative knock rattled her door. Not the desperate, bloody thud from before. 3 crisp, patient raps. Professional. She turned off the tap. The dripping faucet sounded deafening. She crossed to the door, checked the peephole, and found a man in a dark overcoat in the hallway. He looked like an accountant who'd taken up competitive weightlifting. Joe didn't open the door. "Go away," she said through the wood. "Miss Mercer?" the man said, his tone polite, almost bored. "Mr. Costa requests your presence. It's a medical emergency." Joe closed her eyes, forehead against the door. "Take him to a hospital." "We can't do that, ma'am. He was very specific. He needs you." The memory of Roman's bleeding torso flashed behind her eyes. Her hands curled into fists. "I'm not his personal physician. I'm a midwife. Tell him to find a back alley surgeon, MAAM," the man said, urgency finally cracking through. "It's not for him, it's for a girl. She's bleeding heavily. She's pregnant." Joe's eyes snapped open. The cynicism that usually shielded her vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, hard calculation of her profession. A pregnant woman hemorrhaging outside a hospital. The math on that was always deadly. She threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open. The man stepped back, startled. Joe already had her trauma bag over her shoulder. "Drive," she ordered. The ride blurred past in neon light and silence. The man didn't speak, and Joe didn't ask questions. She mentally ran through her supplies: Pitocin, tranexamic acid, clamps, gauze. If it was an abruption, there was nothing she could do without an operating room. If it was a hemorrhage, she had minutes. The car stopped behind a dormant brick warehouse near the docks. The air smelled of salt, rotting kelp, and rusted metal. 2 large men flanked a heavy steel door, parting instantly as Joe and her escort approached. Inside was a cavernous dark, broken only by a makeshift office of frosted glass in the center, fluorescent light spilling out. Joe pushed through the glass door, past the men standing around the perimeter. The room reeked of iron, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Roman stood by a metal desk, coat off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked wrecked, a dark bruise blooming along his jaw, but his eyes stayed sharp. On a leather sofa against the wall lay a girl who couldn't have been older than 20. Her blonde hair was matted with sweat, her face bloodless. A dark, spreading stain soaked the crotch of her sweatpants, dripping rhythmically onto the concrete. "Out!" Joe barked, dropping her bag onto a rolling chair. Roman turned. relief flickering across his face before the hard mask slammed back down. "Josephine," I said, "get out." She didn't look at him, already ripping open a pair of sterile gloves. "All of you, outside the glass, now." The men in the room looked to Roman for the order. He stared at the back of Joe's head, her hands already moving with practiced urgency, checking the girl's pulse, assessing blood loss. "Do what she says," Roman said quietly. The men filed out. He lingered a second longer, watching the rigid line of her spine, then stepped out and pulled the glass door shut behind him. Joe tuned out the watchful shapes pressed against the frosted glass and focused entirely on the girl. "Hey," she said softly, dropping into the warm, anchoring tone she saved for her patients. "What's your name, honey?" "Sylvia." The girl's teeth chattered violently. Shock. "Okay, Sylvia, I'm Joe. I'm going to take care of you. How far along are you?" 12 weeks. A sob. She clutched her stomach. "A minor eye losing it? Please, I can't lose it." Joe's stomach dropped. 12 weeks. The blood on the floor told the rest of the story. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an inevitability. "Sylvia, I need to check you," Joe said gently, hands already stripping away soaked fabric. "Squeeze my hand if it hurts. It was a miscarriage, brutal, incomplete. Tissue hadn't fully cleared, the cervix caught open, causing a massive hemorrhage." The girl's blood pressure was dropping fast. Joe worked almost blind, on muscle memory alone, injecting medication into the girl's thigh to force the uterus to contract and clamp the bleeding vessels. "Breathe with me, Sylvia. In through your nose, out through your mouth." The next 30 minutes turned into a bloody, brutal fight in the middle of a mobster's warehouse. Joe fought the hemorrhage with every trick she had, clearing tissue by hand, packing gauze, massaging the abdomen until her forearms burned. Sylvia cried until her voice gave out, fingernails digging crescent moons into the back of Joe's hand. Joe absorbed it, murmuring low and steady, anchoring the girl while her body tried to tear itself apart. Finally, the bleeding slowed. The uterine muscle clamped into a firm, rigid ball under Joe's palm. The crisis broke. Joe sat back on her heels, chest heaving. Her scrubs were ruined, her hands under the torn gloves slick with blood. The metallic smell in the small office was suffocating. Sylvia had fallen asleep, breathing shallow but steady, a wool blanket tucked to her chin. Joe stood slowly, knees popping, stripped off the gloves, and threw them into a bloody pile on the floor. She crossed to the small sink, turned on the cold water, and scrubbed her hands hard with industrial soap. The glass door opened. Roman stepped in, looked at the blood on the floor, at the sleeping girl, and finally at Joe, gripping the sink edge so hard her knuckles had gone white, trying to control a fine tremor in her shoulders. "Is she?" he started, voice unusually hesitant. "She's alive," Joe said, turning off the tap, not turning to face him. "She lost the pregnancy. She lost a lot of blood. If I'd been 10 minutes later, you'd be rolling her up in a rug." Roman went silent. The heavy quiet of the warehouse pressed back in. Joe finally turned to face him. Her face was pale, eyes dark and hollow. The clinical calm was gone, replaced by raw, scraping anger. "Who is she to you?" she demanded, jabbing a shaking finger at the sofa. "A runner? A girlfriend? Collateral?" Roman's jaw tightened. "She's my sister." Joe froze. The anger in her chest hit a wall. She looked from his hard, unforgiving face to the sleeping girl's soft features, a resemblance there, a sharp curve of cheekbone, the stubborn set of the brow. "She got involved with a man from a rival family," Roman said, voice flat, devoid of emotion, though the muscle jumping in his jaw betrayed him. "They found out tonight, beat him to death in an alley, dragged her out to make her watch. That's what triggered the bleeding." Joe stared at him, horror slowly replacing the adrenaline in her veins. The dark bruise on his jaw wasn't from a random fight. He'd gone in to get his sister back. "You couldn't take her to a hospital," Joe whispered, the pieces sliding into place. "They'd be watching the ERs. If they find her, they finish the job." He stepped closer, harsh light catching the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked down at her, past the blood on her clothes, past the defensive anger. "I didn't bring you here to play games, Josephine. I brought you because you're the only person I trust to keep her alive." The words hung heavy, irretractable. Trust, a dangerous word from a man like him. Joe looked at her hands. Clean now, but they still felt stained. She was in too deep. She'd crossed the invisible line separating her quiet gray world from his violent neon one. And God help her! Looking up into his intense, searching eyes, She understood a terrifying truth. She didn't want to step back. The warehouse was a tomb, and tombs were no place for the living. Joe made that clear before the blood on the concrete floor had even dried. Sylvia needed a sterile environment, 4 fluids, and a bed that didn't reek of diesel, rot, and iron. Roman didn't argue. One phone call, a low, vibrating murmur against the frosted glass, and 10 minutes later they were moving. The safe house was a high-rise condo on the edge of the financial district. It smelled of fresh paint, air-conditioned ozone, and absolute nothing. No personal touches, no photographs, no books on the shelves, just heavy dark leather furniture on cold, polished concrete. A space built purely for hiding, stripped of any humanity. Joe spent the first 3 hours turning the cavernous guest room into a makeshift medical ward. She stripped the high thread count sheets off the mattress, replacing them with a waterproof barrier she'd demanded Roman's men source from an all-night pharmacy across town. She gave Sylvia oral antibiotics, checked her temperature every 30 minutes, listened to the heavy, dragging sound of her breathing in the quiet room. By 4 in the morning, the crisis had settled into a dull, manageable ache. Sylvia slept, her pale face lit by amber streetlight filtering through the blinds. Joe walked out, leaving the heavy oak door cracked enough to hear any movement. The condo was dark except for the cold blue glow of the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. Roman sat at the granite kitchen island, jacket and shoulder holster finally off. The holster sat heavy on the counter, ugly black steel and worn leather, beside a crystal glass of dark amber liquid. He stared blankly at the glass, hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Joe crossed to the sink and started washing her hands under scalding water, welcoming the sharp, grounding sting. She scrubbed the industrial soap under her nails, washing away the phantom feel of blood. "She's stable," Joe said, her voice echoing faintly in the empty room. She didn't turn to face him. "Fever hasn't spiked. Bleeding's minimal now. She's going to hurt for a few days, cramping, fatigue. The rest of it will take much longer. Thank you." His voice was hollow, scraped clean of its usual dangerous edge. Joe turned off the tap. The sudden silence was deafening. She dried her hands slowly and finally turned to look at him. Without the armor of his tailored suit, without the sharp adrenaline of a medical crisis, Roman looked exactly like a man quietly, desperately drowning. The bruise on his jaw had bloomed into an ugly mottled purple-black. He kept rubbing his thumb over the rim of the glass, the repetitive motion betraying a deep, restless anxiety. She pulled out a tall stool across from him, and Saturday, the silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavy, saturated with the intimate, gruesome reality they'd just survived together. "Why didn't you get her completely out of the city?" Joe asked, voice low. "If the people who did this are actively looking for her," he interrupted, looking up, dark eyes catching the blue light, bottomless. "They're not looking for her. They're looking for me. She was bait. They left her alive on purpose, knowing she'd call me, knowing I'd come. But you got her out," Joe pointed out gently. "I lost 3 men getting her out." He took a slow sip of his drink. Sharp whiskey and expensive cologne drifted across the counter. 3 men with wives, with kids, gone. Because I didn't see the threat coming. Because I let my sister date a boy I knew nothing about. Joe watched him. The cynical part of her, the part that had kept her alive on the streets, the part that never trusted men with guns, screamed at her to judge him, to see the monster underneath, calculating a horrific loss of life like a bad hand of cards. But the other part of her, the part that caught babies and held the shaking hands of dying mothers, saw something else entirely. A man carrying an entire dark world on his shoulders, knowing every misstep cost blood. "You can't control everything, Roman," she said softly, leaning her arms on the counter. He laughed, harsh and humorless. "In my line of work, Josephine, if you don't control everything, you end up on a steel slab. Or worse, the people you love do." He leaned forward, forearms on the counter. The sudden closeness was jarring. She could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the rough stubble along his jaw, hear the strained, careful rhythm of his breathing against his stitched ribs. "I bring ruin to everything I touch," he murmured, gaze dropping to her hands resting on the cold stone, his fingers a hair's width from hers. "You should have walked away that night. Should have locked the door and let me bleed out in the hallway. I don't let people die on my floor," Joe replied steadily, though her pulse kicked hard in her throat. She didn't pull her hand back. She held his exhausted stare, feeling a terrifying magnetic pull. And you didn't die. He lifted his hand slowly and traced the outline of her knuckles without touching skin, hovering a fraction above it. The ghost of contact was electric, sending a sharp shiver down her spine. No, he whispered, voice dark and rough. I didn't. And now you're standing right in the middle of the crossfire. He pulled his hand back. The absence of his warmth left a cold patch of air between them. Get some sleep, Joe, he said quietly, eyes returning to his glass. Tomorrow's going to be worse. Tomorrow was worse, and the long, grinding day after it was a masterclass in claustrophobic paranoia. For 72 straight hours, the sterile safe house turned into a pressure cooker. The central air hummed a dull tune that felt like a drill against Joe's temples. Roman's men guarded the reinforced front door, boots occasionally scraping the hallway tile. The scent of stale takeout, bitter coffee, and sterile wipes soaked into the expensive, soulless apartment. Sylvia was healing physically, slowly. The severe bleeding had stopped by early Sunday, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that kept her bedridden. She barely spoke, curled tight on her side, staring blankly at the wall, caught in silent, suffocating grief. Joe did what she could. Coaxed the traumatized girl to drink warm broth, changed her bedding, sat with her for hours offering the same steady, anchoring presence she'd honed over years of clinic work. But the real danger wasn't in the quiet bedroom. It was in the living room. Roman paced relentlessly, a caged, dangerous animal stripped of his territory and control. The phones rang constantly. He answered the burner cells in clipped, low, furious whispers, then snapped them shut and tossed them onto the granite, cracking the plastic. Joe tried to stay out of his way, but the huge apartment suddenly felt too small. Every time she went for water, he was there. Every time she sat on the leather sofa to rest her back, she could feel his eyes tracking her. The tension between them wasn't just atmosphere anymore. It had become physical, thick, jagged, suffocating. Not simply fear, but an undeniable heavy awareness grinding her nerves down to dust. Tuesday evening, the pressure finally broke. Joe stood in the kitchen slicing a lemon for Sylvia's tea, the knife hitting the cutting board in sharp, rhythmic thuds. She was exhausted, her neck aching, her scrubs stiff with dried sweat, and all she wanted was a hot shower that didn't require keeping one ear open for gunfire. Stop pacing, she snapped, the words out before her tired brain could catch them. Roman stopped mid-stride behind her. The silence that followed was total. Joe froze, knife suspended above the board, and slowly turned. He stood 2 feet away, shirt discarded hours ago, unable to bear fabric against his healing stitches. His chest was wrapped heavily in white gauze against dark ink and old, pale scars. He looked dangerous, the hollowed exhaustion gone, replaced by sharp, lethal focus. What did you just say? His voice was soft, deadly. Joe swallowed, but the stubborn defiance that had kept her alive on the streets flared up anyway. She set the knife down. I said, stop pacing. You're wearing a hole in the floor, and it's driving me crazy. If you want to go out there and kill them, go. Just stop trapping us in this waiting room. Roman stared at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Then he closed distance in one fast, fluid step. Joe gasped as her lower back hit the granite counter. He didn't grab her, just planted his hands on the counter on either side of her hips, trapping her with his body heat. He smelled of sweat, adrenaline, and that rich cologne. You think I want to be locked in this cage? He rasped, leaning down until his face was inches from hers, eyes burning. I'm staying in this room because the second I leave, the people hunting me know I'm exposed. Then they find this apartment, then they find you. I didn't ask for your protection, Joe whispered fiercely, breath catching. She was trapped, but she wasn't afraid. That was the terrifying part. A hot, reckless surge pooled low in her stomach. I know, he breathed the words, gaze dropping to her mouth, lingering a long, agonizing second before dragging back up to her eyes. You never ask for anything, do you, Josephine? You just take the broken, bleeding things and stitch them back together. I'm a midwife. I deliver life. I don't fix broken monsters. I am a monster. He said it quietly, an admission scraped raw from somewhere deep. He leaned closer, his gauze-wrapped chest brushing her scrubs. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands, without her permission, came up to rest flat against his hot stomach just below the bandages. his abdominal muscles locking tight under her palms. The contrast between his heat and the cold granite at her back was maddening. "Tell me to step back," he commanded, voice shaking with the effort of holding himself in check, staring at her lips. "Tell me right now you want to go back to your quiet, lonely life, Josephine. Tell me, and I'll walk out that door and leave you alone." She looked up at him. She saw the violence in his past and the inevitable ruin in his future. She remembered the blood on her floor, the dirty money on her table, every sensible reason to push him away. But she also felt the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart under her hands, the undeniable pull that had snapped into place the night he bled onto her rug. The quiet, safe life she'd fought so hard to build suddenly felt like a tomb. Joe gripped his hips, fingernails digging into his bare skin, and pulled him down. It wasn't soft. It was a collision. Roman groaned low and rough, hands sliding off the counter to grip her waist and lift her onto the granite. He kissed her like a starving man, like someone who knew the world was ending right outside the door, and this was his last meal. His mouth was hard, demanding, tasting of whiskey, exhaustion, and ruin. Joe kissed him back with equal ferocity, hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, matching his desperate rhythm. The wet, ragged sound of their breathing filled the sterile kitchen. He caught her lower lip between his teeth, not hard enough to draw blood, but enough to make her gasp, the sound swallowed instantly by his mouth. He was dismantling every boundary she'd built, brick by brick, and as his rough hands slid up her spine, leaving fire in their wake, Joe closed her eyes and let the wall fall. The kiss broke as suddenly as it began. Roman pulled back, chest heaving, eyes wide and unfocused for a moment. He stumbled backward, boots scraping the concrete. The sudden loss of his heat left her shivering on the counter. She touched her swollen mouth. It tasted like copper and whiskey. "I shouldn't have done that," he rasped, wiping the back of his hand across his jaw. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by thick armor. "Pack a bag. I'm getting you out of here." Joe slid off the counter, legs unsteady, but the pragmatic core of her brain was already taking over. "You can't move, Sylvia. She's too weak. If she bleeds again in a moving car, she dies. If she stays here, she dies anyway." Roman picked up his shoulder holster from the island, checking the magazine of his heavy black pistol with sharp mechanical clicks. "My men haven't checked in for 20 minutes. The perimeter's compromised." Before Joe could fully process his words, the heavy oak door splintered. Not a subtle break-in. A shotgun blast tore through the deadbolt in a deafening concussive roar, wood shrapnel exploding into the entryway. Roman moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Joe by the shoulder of her scrubs and hurled her behind the granite island. She hit the floor hard, knees bruising against concrete. "Stay down!" he roared over the chaos. 3 men in dark tactical gear poured through the shattered doorway. The sterile apartment filled instantly with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the rapid stutter of automatic fire. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind the living room sofa shattered, showering the leather furniture with glittering shards. Joe curled tight beneath the granite overhang, the noise physical, pounding against her eardrums, rattling her teeth. She covered her head, eyes shut, smelling pulverized drywall mixing with fresh blood. Roman returned fire, exposed at the edge of the kitchen, his pistol barking. 2 clean shots dropped the first man. The second sprayed wild, shredding the cabinets above Joe's head. Porcelain plates exploded, showering her back with ceramic dust. "Sylvia!" Joe screamed, her voice swallowed whole by the gunfire. She opened her eyes. Roman was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his left bicep, tearing muscle. He didn't flinch, kept firing, forcing the last attackers back toward the ruined doorway. Joe didn't wait for permission. She crawled on hands and knees across the glass-strewn floor toward the guest bedroom. A bullet buried itself in the drywall inches from her face, dusting her lashes with white chalk. She kept crawling, kicked the bedroom door open. Sylvia sat up in bed, face bloodless, hands clamped over her ears, screaming a silent, terrified scream. "Get up," Joe commanded, voice harsh, no room for gentleness. "Shoes on, now, we're leaving." Sylvia shook her head rigidly, frozen. Joe grabbed her arm and hauled her off the mattress. Sylvia collapsed to the floor, sobbing. "I can't walk. You'll walk or you'll die here." Joe pulled her up by the waist, draping the girl's arm over her shoulder, absorbing half her weight, her own exhausted muscles screaming in protest. They staggered out just as the gunfire abruptly cut off. The sudden ringing quiet felt worse than the noise, thick, expectant. Roman stood alone in the wrecked living room, 3 bodies lay motionless near the entryway. The apartment looked like a war zone. He ejected the spent magazine, hot metal clattering onto the concrete, and slammed a fresh one home. He looked at Joe, chest heaving, eyes flicking to the blood dripping steadily down his arm, then to the terrified girl leaning against her side. "Service elevator," he ordered, gesturing sharply toward the back of the kitchen. "Go." The descent in the metal service elevator felt like a slow drop into purgatory. The overhead light flickered, throwing sick yellow shadows across the cramped box. It reeked of garbage and grease. Sylvia leaned against the wall, eyes shut, surrendered to the pain radiating through her abdomen. Joe stood rigid beside her, staring at the metal doors, hands shaking. The sudden crash of adrenaline leaving her hollow, cold, nauseous. Roman stood in front of them, blocking the view of the doors, blood dripping steadily from his torn bicep onto the floor, matching the rhythm of Joe's racing pulse. "We need a new car," he murmured, voice strained. "They'll be watching the garage. There's a clinic van parked in the alley behind my old building," Joe heard herself say, startled by the flat, dead tone of her own voice. "Keys are in my pocket. It's unmarked. Smells like bleach and vomit, but it runs." Roman turned his head to look at her, dark eyes searching her pale face for panic, for anger, for a demand to be let go. He found none of it, only cold, pragmatic resolve. "If you drive that van for me tonight, Josephine, there's no going back," he warned softly. "You become an accessory. You cross the line completely. They'll hunt you just as hard as they hunt me." The elevator lurched, grinding to a halt at the sublevel. The doors slid open on the dark, cavernous parking garage. Joe looked at the blood on Roman's arm, then at her own ruined scrubs, dusted with drywall and speckled with someone else's blood. The quiet gray life she'd fought so hard to protect was officially over. It had died the moment she opened her door to a bleeding stranger on a stormy night. She could deny it, she could run from it, but the stain was already set into the fabric of her. She didn't want the quiet life anymore. She wanted the terrifying electric truth standing bleeding in front of her. Joe reached into her scrub pocket, cold fingers closing around the heavy keyring, and pulled it free. The keys jingled in the damp garage air. "Van's 3 blocks east," she said firmly, stepping past Roman toward the dark garage. She didn't look back. "Keep up, Roman. I'm not waiting for you." A rough sound tore out of his throat, half sigh, half dark laugh. He tightened his grip on the pistol and slipped into the shadows behind her. The rain had started again outside, hammering the concrete ramp, smelling of wet asphalt, cold ozone, and the promise of a long, violent night. Joe stepped into the downpour, hair soaking instantly, and guided the traumatized Sylvia through the dark, winding alleys of the sleeping city. Roman walked a few steps behind, his silhouette folding into the storm. He was a violent man from a violent world, and she was the cynical midwife who'd stubbornly decided to catch him. They reached the rusted, dented white van idling in the dark alley. Joe hit the unlock button and climbed into the cold, ripped vinyl driver's seat. Roman slid into the passenger side, his frame dwarfing the small cabin. He looked over at her, streetlight catching the fresh blood, the deep bruises, and the dark, absolute possession burning in his tired eyes. Joe turned the key. The engine roared to life, drowning out the rain. She threw it into gear and drove straight into the dark.